Hello and welcome to this webinar on farm wells and drinking water quality. I'm Andy Lazur. I'm a water quality specialist with University of Maryland Extension. And the co-presenter I'd like to introduce is Rachel Rosenberg-Goldstein.
Thank you, Andy. My name's Rachel Rosenberg-Goldstein, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Health in the Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health.
This webinar is part of a project that a group of us from Extension have put together, again, trying to do some initial assessment of drinking water well quality on farms. And besides Rachel and myself, we have 7 of the ag agents involved: Alan Leslie from Charles County, Andrew Ness from Hartford, Ben Beal from St. Mary's, Jeff Semler from Washington County, Kelly Nichols from Montgomery County, Sarah Hirsch from Somerset, and Shannon Dill from Talbot County. So this is about a 1.5-year project that we're looking at to, again, collect samples from farmer participants. We have collected about 67 so far, and we're continuing to collect a little bit more. And so we're going to share some of that data, but I'd like to go ahead and share with you a couple of things that we're going to talk about today. And please type in any questions that you have in the chat. And then also we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So I'm going to give a presentation a little bit about aquifers and general wells. What are they like? Talk about some of the important water quality parameters of drinking water. And then we'll share with some of the results that we have so far. And then some tips on how you can protect your well and water quality, and talk a little bit about treatment as well. So just to start off, it's just important to note anytime we talk about wells that there's this hydrologic cycle that's really important. And one of the big take-homes here is that, when precipitation falls, it's hitting ground and or water surface, and then some of that water infiltrates into the soil, and then we're picking it back up through wells, and the plants, of course, are transpiring it. So it's this big cycle that's very fundamental and very important. And it's also important to note that a fair number of people, about 28% of Marylanders, are using wells as drinking water. So again, it's a very important source, groundwater. And here's a little schematic just to show you a little bit about what an aquifer is. And there's different types of aquifers. And this right here is typically the shallow water table right here, okay? This type of water table is unconfined and it's not protected. And so anything that, any sort of contamination that may enter on the ground will infiltrate into that water table. And sometimes you can even have a water table, what's called perched water table, which is actually above an elevation of the normal groundwater table. But then we have wells here, and this well, for example, here is a confined aquifer because it is in this aquifer right here that is protected by this confining layer, which is very tight geology, essentially. It could be compacted soils, but it's very tight. Water does infiltrate into that, but it may take decades or even longer to really infiltrate in there. So these confined aquifers tend to be more protected from any sort of surface contamination. And then if we look at Maryland on the coastal plain, we have multiple types of aquifers that are indeed protected by these confining beds. So these gray area here are different confining beds, and then the aquifers, again, are protected. In contrast that with the Piedmont region of the state, where we have what's called fractured rock geology. That could be limestone or karst, whatever the case may be. Well, what happens here is that you get fractures in the rock, essentially, and it's those fractures which serve as the reservoir or the aquifer for water. And so the challenge with these types of wells, when you drill them, is that you never really know how many fractures you're going to tap into. Whereas on the coastal plain, you can pretty much tell if you go a certain depth in a certain location, you're gonna hit a specific aquifer. Here, for example, this well, you can see it's tapped into essentially 2 main fractures, this small one here, and then this fracture right here is actually connected to the groundwater. So this particular well could be subject to contaminations reaching groundwater, rather. That could be road salt, could be fertilizer, whatever the case may be. So again, different types of geology and different types of wells, and that it will influence water quality, because the aquifer will pick up minerals that are into the soil. So every well is different as far as its quality, particularly in the Piedmont region in fractured rock. So we're going to talk a little bit about drinking water wells and some of the components and some of the key parts about wells and how to protect them. So this particular graphic is just showing you the anatomy, if you will, of a well. And you can see on the right here, we have a drilled well. Here's the wellhead above the ground right here. And then in order for this to work inside your, could be your home or, some outbuilding, you have a pressured tank or a bladder tank. And so anytime a faucet is opened up in the home, that bladder pressure pushes water out into the, goes through this pressure switch, and then it goes into the home. And this diagram here on the right is showing, again, another drilled well, but it's showing a little bit more here. You can see this outer layer right here is what's called grout. And this is very important because it acts as a sealant. When they drill the well, they'll pour this grout, and it goes all the way around the pipe, and it's to prevent any sort of surface water from kind of following that path of the pipe all the way down into the aquifer. So it's there to reduce surface contamination. And then a drilled well will have a screen and such. So when we look at specific things about what you can do to inspect your well, it's important to look at your wellhead periodically. Obviously, try to avoid any sort of contact with it with machinery, because it can crack both the casing, particularly if it's plastic, or it can crack the well cap. What you see here, and I'll show you a picture of a sanitary well cap, but you can see the ground is sloping away from the wellhead. And that is very important because that helps for the water to drain away from the well. So that's important. So that grout seal is very important. So you can check the casing, check the sanitary well cap. And here's a picture of a well cap here. It could be plastic or metal, and you can see it has this black seal on it. So it's a protective seal to prevent any sort of bugs, or, for example, to get into it. Insects love to get into really tight places, and oftentimes they get in, if it's not a very secure well cap, it can get in there, and when they die, they drop off into the well and into and then can actually be pumped up. Okay, so these are relatively inexpensive devices, but they go a long way in protecting your well and your water quality. So why should we care? Well, I like to say that just as much as you are what you eat, you are what you drink. Our bodies for adults are, a little over 60% water, so it makes sense that we want to drink good quality water. With well water, it's important to note that the homeowner, the well owner, is responsible because it's not a public source. The public source of water, city water, is regulated by the EPA and then delegated down to the states, and that goes through an extensive water testing as well as treatment. So the homeowner on a well is responsible. And then the other thing is that a lot of the contaminants that we'll talk about in just a minute, you wouldn't know that you have them. You wouldn't taste them, nor would you smell any sort of odor. Some you might. And then again, depending upon the contaminant, there are certain health risks potentially, again, and these can cause, things such as, gastrointestinal distress, neurological effects, and cancer, depending upon the contaminant. And then certain populations are particularly vulnerable to certain contaminants, and that would be children, pregnant women, and anybody who is immunocompromised. So what can you do to protect your well water? It's good to know about your well. If it's a fairly recent completed well, you might be able to get a copy of what's called the well log from the county environmental health office, for example. And I already talked about inspecting the well. Just make sure that it's, hasn't been damaged. And then keep records of anything that you've done to the well. If you've had it repaired or if you had water tests, keep those records in a good place so that you can refer back to them, because we all forget about, did I change that filter, or did I check it well? Did I pump my septic tank? And so it's really good to keep some records so you know when you should be doing something. And then test your drinking water. And we'll talk about that in just a minute here. So these are basic recommendations that we have as far as testing your well water. I'm going to walk through a couple of these. We have the bacteria and the nitrates and other of the metals. And there could be some contaminants locally based on the geology. They're naturally occurring deposits such as arsenic, radium, and radon. And you could contact your local county environmental health office to determine, is your well located in one of those areas where they have observed these particular type of contaminants. I'm going to let Rachel talk a little bit about bacteria.
Great. Thank you, Andy. So I just wanted to go into a little bit of detail about the bacteria that are recommended for testing. And so these are recommended for testing partly because this is what EPA requires to be tested when we think about municipal water. So the first type of bacteria is called total coliform bacteria. And this is really just a large group of bacteria. So you can see from this image that I'm showing on this slide that total coliforms contain lots of different types of bacteria. But in general, total coliforms indicate that there could be some source of pollution. So they're an indicator bacteria that there could be some pollution in your water. And total coliforms are really everywhere in the environment. So they could be coming from your soil, they could be coming from fecal matter, either human or animal. And then as Andy was talking about, with well caps that aren't well sealed, there could also be insects. So there are lots of different sources for these types of bacteria. And then the standard that we use when we look at municipal drinking water, public drinking water, is that there can't be more than one positive sample per month if someone's collecting less than 40 samples per month. And then Andy, can you go to the next slide for me? Thank you. So then the other type of bacteria that is recommended for testing is generic E. coli. So generic E. coli is part of this large group of total coliforms. So you can see in this figure that we start with this big group of total coliforms, and then within total coliforms, we have another subgroup called fecal coliforms. And so these are indicator bacteria as well, and they indicate exactly what it sounds like. So they indicate that there could have been some fecal contamination. And then one type of fecal coliforms are E. coli. So when we talk about recommended testing and when we get into the results for this project, we're looking at something called generic E. coli. So we're looking at this whole range of E. coli. And we know that there are some types of E. coli which can cause illness, and those are called pathogenic E. coli. And then the type of E. coli that you typically hear about in the news for things like foodborne outbreaks is one specific type of E. coli called E. coli 0157H7. But I just want to really emphasize here that when we talk about testing your wells and when we talk about our results, we're looking at generic E. coli. And in general, generic E. coli don't necessarily cause disease. So again, these are indicator bacteria. They indicate that there could have been some fecal material in the water. And so it suggests that this is something that you would want to look into more. But again, E. coli, just like total coliforms, are widely present in the GI tract of both humans and animals. So it's generic E. coli that we're interested in. And here the limit is 0. So you don't want to identify any E. coli in your water.
Thank you, Rachel, for that information. And so I will then talk a little bit about some of the other tests that are important to do. Again, the ones in red, as was just mentioned, the bacteria, and then nitrates, it's recommended to test annually. And then the other parameters, if you haven't tested in a while, or if you have a new well, it's good to test for a couple of other parameters, including chloride, copper, hardness, lead, manganese, pH, total dissolved solid sulfates. And again, as I mentioned, if you're in any of those areas that have some natural deposits of contaminants, that would be good. So this type of suite of information will really serve as a good guide of the type of water quality that you have, and it gives you a peace of mind if they're negative that or low that you have good water quality. So testing is very, very important. It's really the only way to know what you're drinking. So it's great. It is a cost, but again, you only have to test annually for those 3, and then the others you can test every 5 years or so. I did want to mention that 2 parameters that are important for farmers are pH and hardness. And the reason for that is that they can impact the effectiveness of pesticides. Okay, so pesticides work best at a moderately low pH of 4 to 6.5. If it gets outside that range, certainly if it's even more acidic than 4, or it gets too high above neutral, which is 7, that can actually facilitate the degradation of the pesticide. And then hardness, which is basically the measure of calcium and magnesium, and those are positively charged ions, they can actually bind to the pesticide and, again, reduce its effectiveness. So it's important to understand that. And then if you have water that's very hard, or your pH is out of adjustment, there are things that you can do with particular pesticide, and you can read the label. There are some conditioners that can help improve the effectiveness. Again, they can bind with other types of positively charged ions, including aluminum, iron, magnesium, and sodium to some extent, in that order. So they really tend to bind with aluminum and iron and magnesium more so than calcium and sodium. And then the other thing to think about is suspended solids, because if you have these are the solids that might add a little color to the water, okay, turbidity to the water, and they can bind to the herbicide and actually reduce the ability of the plant to uptake that pesticide, that herbicide. So again, bottom line, at least test for pH and hardness if you're using the well, your drinking water well, for, say, mixing up your pesticides. Here's a graphic that I wanted to show you, just re-emphasizing those natural deposits of contaminate. Parts of the eastern shore into southern Maryland, we have radium and radon, and another little bit of arsenic over in western Maryland. And we're also seeing some brackish water intrusion. So again, you could determine if you're located in that area by actually contacting your local county health department. And then you could also test if you're seeing specific issues with your water. Okay, let's just say you have brown or kind of an orangey black stain. That could be iron or manganese. So you could test for those. Iron is not necessarily a health risk. Manganese can be, particularly for children at certain concentrations. You could have issues with scale formation, or this kind of white film that can form on dishes, and that's usually an indication of hardness. And then certainly, there's other things like chloride and sodium that, obviously you would know if it's elevated that you would have some sort of salty taste. But another one that's important too, if you see any blue staining on your bathroom appliances, or if you have pinhole leaks, if you have copper, that's generally an indication of corrosive water. And that's a combination of not only pH impacts that, but your alkalinity as well as the chloride level and sulfate. So it's a kind of a formula to really calculate that corrosive water. But that corrosive water can then leach out metals from your piping, your plumbing, and that's why you would get that blue stain. So again, there are some visual things that you can see and kind of guide you as far as what you might also want to test for. I'll turn it back over to Rachel. We're going to talk a little bit about some preliminary results.
Great. Thank you, Andy. And I just want to upfront give credit to my student, Cameron Smith, who's the one who both analyzed the water samples for these bacteria in our lab and also did the data analysis and produced the figures I'm going to show you. So when we looked at the water samples that we collected for this project, we had 67 total water samples. And again, we wanted to look at these 2 bacteria that are recommended for testing. So again, that big group of indicator bacteria, total coliforms. And here we saw that 39% of our samples did have this type of bacteria present. And then it's always recommended that when you test for total coliforms, you follow that up by testing for E. coli. So again, this is a more specific indicator that there could be some fecal contamination. So for these water samples, 10% of our samples tested positive for E. coli. And then Andy, can you go to the next slide for me? Thank you. So Cameron also did some work looking at differences by region in what we saw for total coliforms and E. coli. And you can see from this figure that we did see some really significant differences between our regions, both for total coliforms and also for E. coli. So you can see that there were a greater percentage of samples that were positive for both total coliforms and E. coli in the western region of Maryland. And, you know, we're still working through our hypothesis of why we think this is happening, but we think this could go back to some of that fractured rock geology that Andy showed at the beginning of his presentation. All right, Andy, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, so what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about just some preliminary information about some of the metals that we observed. A couple of things here of note is that 3 of the samples had arsenic. Then we had several that had elevated concentrations of nitrate for the 67 wells. And then here on the sodium aspect, we had a fair number that actually had elevated sodium above the 60 milligrams per liter that EP has. Not necessarily a health issue unless you're on a low sodium diet, and that would be something that you may want to look at. And there's treatment for all of these. That's the good news here, is there's treatment for all of these different types of issues that we're talking about today. You just need to know what the water quality is and determine if treatment is warranted. Sometimes it's not because the concentrations are very, very low and not identified as being a health risk. So again, we're still collecting some information, but this gives a little bit of overview of what we've seen in our farm wells. And then the other thing I make about the sodium, not quite half of those that had elevated sodium had water softeners in their homes to try to reduce that hardness. And of course, a water softener, you're using salt. And when you add salt, you're basically putting in, chloride and sodium in your water. And so it would make sense that you're going to see elevated sodium when you have a water softener. They are new water softeners, what's called saltless, necessarily a filter. It's more of a conditioner, and it doesn't use any of the salt. And so those are fairly new, probably in the last 7-8 years or so, and they're still developing that technology. So a couple of more things, tips on how you can protect your water. Just again, be aware of your wellhead and try to mind the activities that you do. Again, you don't want to bump into the wellhead with any sort of machinery. Be sure that well cap is good, as I mentioned, and also the land slopes away. Another thing to do is typically, is to pump your septic tank, and you want to keep your septic system operating effectively. And that's very important. Typical rule of thumb is to, have your tank pumped every 3 to 5 years. And of course, that'll depend upon the number of occupants and the size of the tank and things like that. But 3 to 5 is a general, good rule of thumb. And, the reason that pumping a septic tank is important is that you don't want that excess solids to go out into your drain field. Okay, this is a septic tank, conventional system. Here's the distribution box, and you have your gravel trenches. And so it's designed for the wastewater, after it's been settled a little bit, for it to enter here, and then it percolates down into the gravel and into the soil. And then eventually, though, however, some of that wastewater that's not fully treated by the soil will enter groundwater. So we want to be sure that we maintain our septic systems so that we're minimizing the impact in water quality. So other tips: reduce any sort of chemical use near your wellhead, for example. Store your chemicals properly. Avoid any sort of spillage near your well, because again, that could ultimately reach groundwater. If you have any underground storage tanks, be sure that they're in good condition and not leaking. And then this is really important. If you are aware of any abandoned wells on your property, be sure that they're properly sealed. And what that involves, and the reason this is important, is because an abandoned well, and here's just a picture of one, kind of give you an idea. And then this graphic is showing if you have an abandoned well, it basically acts like a direct conduit to the groundwater. And you can see from this visual that would make sense. So if anything is running off through rain, whatever that may be, it's going to contaminate groundwater. So it's important to seal these, and it's not something that you just fill in with dirt. It really needs to be filled properly. Even regular concrete is not advised. There's, again, proper materials specifically for sealing wells, and that'll prevent any sort of surface contamination from entering the well. So with that, I want to share some resources here. I also mentioned that you will get a copy of this video, and so you'll have these resource links available to you. Certainly welcome you to reach out. There's a wealth of information on these different sites here. Also encourage you to, again, if you wanted more information about your well, if it's probably in the last 20 to 30 years, the health department may have a record of that well. Gives you an idea of how deep it is, when it was dug, who dug it, and all that sort of stuff, and that's great. And the Maryland Geological Survey has a lot of information on groundwater, as does the Maryland Department of Environment. So with that, we will go ahead and take questions. You're welcome to type them into the chat, or go ahead and just unmute yourself and ask. See, do we have any in the chat?
Yeah, there's a question about PFAS.
Is a very hot topic. So PFAS is polyfluoroalkyl substances, and basically what that is, chemicals that have the carbon and fluoride bond, which is very, very resistant and persistent. And there is literally thousands and thousands of these PFAS compounds. These PFAS compounds are in so many different products. The typical one would be like Teflon or Scotchgard, any of those things that repel water. But they're found in, food packaging. They're found in cosmetics, clothing, and then also even dental floss, for example. So they're in literally, hundreds of different products. And the challenge is that they're very persistent. Some of them have been studied to where they can increase health risks, cancer and things like that. So there's a lot that we don't know about PFAS, concerning part, but what we do know is that, again, they're everywhere. They're very persistent. They get into the groundwater. There is treatment for it, and some of the filtration systems, like even reverse osmosis, helps with a lot of that. But again, we've probably, out of the literally 8,000 PFAS compounds, they've studied maybe just a few hundred of them at best, and so there's a lot that we don't know. Let's see, is there a level for which we need to treat for radon, and how do you treat for it? Yeah, that's a great question. Typically when we think of radon, we're thinking about, well, what might be in the soil and underneath our house. There are treatments for that. Okay, this is a good question about adding bleach to the well periodically. In general, we don't recommend doing that unless you know you need it. You don't treat unless you know you have a problem. So, for example, if the well cap or there was some service done to the well, typically it's best to have that well disinfected at that time, because it could be an entry point for some sort of, again, contamination, bacterial contamination. For example, if you pull out the well and they put it on the ground, then, as Rachel mentioned, some of those coliform bacteria are everywhere in the soil, and so you could contaminate it. So yes, anytime a well is serviced, it should be disinfected. There's a good question about springs and can it be used safely? It's possible. It really depends upon the conditions and where that water is coming from. You'd definitely have to test a spring, because a spring is shallow groundwater essentially. It runs the risk of being more in direct contamination from any sort of surface issues, whatever that may be. You would have to have it tested to really identify whether or not it can be used safely. I mean, spring water is bottled all the time, and you know, again, they're testing that water to determine, you know, the basics. The degree of testing, I think, varies between companies, but again, springs can be good water quality, but again, for drinking purposes, you definitely would want to test it to verify that. Okay, so this is another question about when you're testing for metals, is there one test that is good? Well, you have to basically test for each individual parameter for each metal, for example. Some of the labs do offer a kind of a package type of thing where they may test for most of the ones that I suggested earlier, but you may have to specifically ask for them. So, for example, if you were to find out from your county health department that your well is located in the arsenic area, you'd have to specifically ask for that particular test in addition to anything else that you want to test for. I will also suggest if you have any other questions about your well or water quality, feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to help, and appreciate your time today. I want to thank Rachel, and also thank all of our ag agents that are participating in this project. It's great to work with folks and great to work with the farmers. So we appreciate all that. Oh, we got another question here. That is there a way to determine the life of an aquifer? Well, the aquifers themselves, you know, which is the source of water, were formed over, you know, thousands and, you know, eons of years. So they'll be around. There's a question about should we worry about contamination in an area that's farmed? Not necessarily. I think it's, you know, again, what you have to do is determine if there is any sort of direct connection. For example, if you're in fractured rock geology, there could be, but not necessarily. So it really varies greatly. Rachel, I don't know if you have any other comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's just what you've said. I think it's really important to test annually as recommended, because there's so many differences between wells depending on where you are. So you really want to know what's going on with your specific well.
Yeah, thank you. Here's a question popping in again. Are Maryland aquifers good for the long term? I would say absolutely. In general, that is the case. I mean, we have a lot of good quality well water. There are differences in areas, and in the Piedmont area in particular, because of that fractured rock, the water quality can vary more so than, say, if you're on the eastern shore in a coastal plain geology, where again you have confined aquifers, you have that protection. So, but you need to test. All right, I think there's another question here real quickly about UV light. UV light can be used to treat for bacteria. That is one of the treatments. Again, if you know you have an issue with bacteria, typically the first step would be to disinfect the well, try to determine where the source is if you can. Maybe it's a broken well cap and that may be the source, but you'd want to fix it and then, you know, disinfect the well and then retest after a period. And I have information on the website on specifically how to disinfect a well, so I'll be happy to help that. But if you do have a kind of a continued bacteria issue, ultraviolet light or a chlorination system are two of the possible treatment systems that can be used. All right, I think we'll wrap up there. Again, pleasure to visit with you today. Test your water, and if you have any questions, we'll look to hear back from you. Oh, here's another question. That's great. 80 feet deep, 300 feet from the Potomac near Sharpsburg. Are there specific problems? No, not necessarily. You know, groundwater in Maryland, a lot of the stream and flow is actually connected to groundwater. It not necessarily. I would just say, you know, test, as we've mentioned today, test for the bacteria, the nitrates, and again, if you haven't tested before, test for those other parameters to get an idea of what that water quality is. All right, I think we'll stop right there. Great to visit with you today. Thank you.